The question that the image of a soldier stopping a panzer with a shovel demands is not the obvious one, not how he did it, though how he did it is extraordinary and will be examined here, but why he had to. Why was a man in a shallow scrape in the ground with an entrenching tool the answer to a German armored vehicle in 1941 or 1942 or 1943, when every army that had entered the war had developed anti-tank weapons specifically to avoid exactly this scenario? The answer to that question is an institutional story about the gap between what anti-tank doctrine specified should be available to an infantry unit facing armored attack and what was actually available in the forward positions of the Eastern Front during the periods when close-range improvised anti-tank combat produced the documented cases that the Soviet after-action reports preserve. That gap, the distance between the doctrine and the reality, is what put the shovel in the man's hand. Understanding it requires understanding both the pre-war thinking about how infantry would stop tanks and the specific operational conditions that made that thinking inadequate for the situation it was supposed to address. The fundamental problem of infantry anti-tank defense had been identified by every major army following the tank's introduction in the First World War, and had been addressed by every major army with weapon systems that, by 1939, were theoretically capable of defeating the tank models then in service. The dedicated anti-tank gun, a low-profile, high-velocity weapon designed to fire an armor-piercing round at flat trajectory against the relatively thin armor of contemporary tank designs, was the standard solution, supplemented in Soviet service by the large-caliber anti-tank rifle, and in German service by the Panzerbuchse. The doctrine that accompanied these weapons specified their deployment in positions covering the likely approaches to infantry defensive lines, with fields of fire that created overlapping zones of anti-tank coverage, and with the depth to maintain that coverage even if forward positions were overrun. The doctrine was coherent, and the weapons it specified were capable of defeating the tanks they were designed to engage. The problem that the Eastern Front revealed in the summer of 1941 was that doctrine is not a physical presence, and weapons are not self-deploying, and the conditions of the German advance in the opening weeks of Barbarossa were destroying the physical presence of the anti-tank defense faster than the doctrine's architecture could rebuild it. The scale of the German advance in June and July of 1941 was unprecedented in the specific sense that it generated rates of advance and depths of penetration that the Soviet Army's logistics and command system could not cope with in real time. Units that were supposed to be holding the positions from which anti-tank guns covered the infantry's defensive lines were encircled before they could establish those positions. Anti-tank guns that were in transit to forward positions were captured or destroyed in the encircling movements that the German combined arms advance was producing. The specific organizational structure that made an infantry division's anti-tank defense function, the deployment of guns, the establishment of communication with higher command to identify the axis of attack, the coordination of anti-tank gunfire with the infantry positions the guns were covering, required time and stability that the pace of the German advance was not providing. Soviet infantry units in the summer of 1941 were frequently fighting without the anti-tank coverage that doctrine specified they should have, not because the doctrine was wrong, but because the operational situation had destroyed the physical means of implementing it before it could be implemented. Into this gap, the Soviet Army dropped the Istrebitel Tankov, the tank destroyer infantry, as an improvised solution to a problem that the doctrine had not anticipated at this scale. The concept of close-range infantry anti-tank combat was not new. It appeared in the manuals of every major army as a last resort measure, the option to be employed when all designated anti-tank weapons had been exhausted and the tank was still coming. What was new on the Eastern Front was the frequency with which this last resort was the first resort available, because the designated anti-tank weapons were absent. The Red Army's response was to take the last resort and train for it systematically, to produce men who were specifically prepared for the close-range anti-tank engagement, equipped with the best improvised and dedicated close-range anti-tank weapons available, and trained in the techniques that gave a man on foot a realistic probability of disabling a tank at arm's length without being killed in the process. The weapons and techniques available to the Istrebitel Tankov evolved through the war in ways that reflect the specific operational lessons being learned. The Molotov cocktail, the improvised incendiary device that Soviet factory workers produced in the hundreds of thousands in the first weeks of Barbarossa using milk bottles and fuel, was the initial improvised weapon and remained in use throughout the war for its specific capability. Placed on the engine compartment of a tank, it could start a fire that the crew could not extinguish without exposing themselves. The problem with the Molotov cocktail was the problem with all close-range anti-tank weapons, getting close enough to use it while the tank's crew and supporting infantry were actively trying to prevent this. The technique that addressed this problem was the approach under cover of smoke, terrain, and artillery fire, using the tank's own hull as cover from the supporting infantry that posed the greater immediate threat to the approaching tank hunter, and timing the final approach to the moments when the tank's limited visibility from inside the closed hull position reduced its crew's awareness of the immediate environment. The entrenching tool in this context was not primarily a weapon in the direct combat sense. It was the tool that made the approach possible, used to dig the scrapes and shallow depressions from which the tank hunter could observe and approach with minimum exposure, used to clear debris from approach routes, and used in the specific close-range moments when a tank's track assembly could be disrupted mechanically. The specific mechanical vulnerability that the entrenching tool addressed was the track link system, the connected series of steel links and pins that translated the rotation of the drive sprocket into the forward movement of the track. A solid object wedged between a track link and the drive sprocket, or between the track and the hull, could cause a thrown track that immobilized the vehicle. At walking speed in urban terrain, with the tank unable to see the man at arm's length below its hull, the entrenching tool was a specific instrument for a specific mechanical disruption that required proximity, timing, and the specific knowledge of where on the track assembly the disruption was most effectively applied. The institutional response to the close-range anti-tank problem produced a body of tactical knowledge that was Soviet in its origin, and that the armies that fought the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet, found themselves incorporating into their doctrine in ways that had not been anticipated before the war. German infantry units facing Soviet T-34s with inadequate anti-tank gun coverage developed their own improvised close-range anti-tank techniques, producing the Haftladung magnetic-shaped charge, and eventually the Panzerfaust single-shot rocket, which reduced the proximity requirement from arm's length to approximately 30 yards. The reduction in proximity requirement was decisive. The difference between a weapon requiring the user to touch the tank and a weapon requiring him to stand within 30 yards of it was the difference between a survival probability that could be increased by training and technique, and a survival probability that was primarily determined by the tank crew's reaction time. The Panzerfaust made the close-range anti-tank problem institutionally manageable in a way that the entrenching tool never could. The American Army's response to the close-range anti-tank problem in Normandy and the subsequent campaigns in Western Europe reflected a different institutional calculus, one that had been shaped by the expectation that tank destroyers, fighter bombers, and attached armor would address the German tank threat before it reached the infantry's immediate position. When German tanks reached American infantry positions despite those measures, the results were frequently similar to the Eastern Front's early experience. The bazooka, the American shoulder-fired rocket launcher, reduced the proximity requirement to workable range and provided the American infantrymen with a dedicated close-range anti-tank weapon that the entrenching tool never was. But the bazooka operator who found himself without rockets, facing a tank at close range, faced the same calculation that the Soviet tank hunter had faced, the specific, terrifying question of what he had available and whether he was willing to use it. The soldier who stopped a panzer with a shovel represents an extreme case of a problem that every army fighting armored forces had to solve at the institutional level, and that every army failed to fully solve in advance because the specific conditions that produced the extreme case, the absence of designated anti-tank weapons at the moment of armored contact, were produced by operational situations that doctrine could describe but could not prevent. The doctrine said that anti-tank guns should be deployed in overlapping positions covering the infantry's defensive front. The reality was that anti-tank guns were destroyed, captured, ran out of ammunition, or never arrived, and the tank was still coming. The entrenching tool was in the man's hand because it was what he had. The calculation he made when the tank was close enough was made under conditions that the institutional failures of the system he was part of had produced. He was the last element of an anti-tank defense that had failed everywhere between the designated anti-tank gun position and his shallow scrape in the ground, and the question the shovel in his hand poses is not about the man's courage, which is beyond dispute. It is about the system that put him there with a shovel as the last line of defense against 30 tons of steel, and whether the system understood what it was asking of him when it placed the shovel in his hand and the tank in front of him and told him that these were the resources available,